I'm here with designer and author Kate Richbourg. Welcome, Kate.
Thanks, Katie.
You're welcome. Today we're talking about adding color to your jewelry, and you have a great idea for adding color to metalwork.
That's right, with a stone.
All right.
And this is all about a little ruby that's going to add some color.
Oh, I can't wait to see.
Okay, so let's get started.
Okay.
All right. So first, what we're going to do to make the ruby tag pendant is we just need to cut out a little tag from some 20 gauge sterling silver metal. This is about 1 inch by a little more than 1/4 of an inch wide.
Okay.
And once we've cut it out, we want to go ahead and just smooth the edges so it's a nice simple operation here. So they're just nice and smooth. For filing, we remember that we want to go in just one direction, and we want to go all the way around this pendant so everything's nice and clean so it doesn't snag on anything.
And you're using sterling, but you could use other jewelry making metals.
You sure could. Any metal for jewelry making will work for sure. Now, we're going to put this aside. We're going to revisit it in a moment, but we've got to prepare the bezel for the stone because we want to set that stone in a bezel. So what I do here is I've used some painter's tape, and the painter's tape really comes in handy. I just cut a little strip and I wrap it around that little ruby stone. Now the stone is small, it's a little fiddly, but with a little practice, you can do it. It's not that difficult. Then I'm going to take that piece of tape that I've measured around my stone, and I go ahead and I lay that on some bezel wire. Now the bezel wire is a lot thinner than this 20 gauge metal that I'm using. The bezel wire is about a 28 gauge, 26 gauge, just depends on what people like to use. But then I cut along my little tape line here until I have a nice little bezel.
Okay, and that's going to form the shape.
That's right. So I'm going to form that strip into a bezel using the round nose of my round nose plier.
Okay, now when you cut it, do you just use snips?
I do. I use some very fine wire cut or wire snips here, shears for cutting sheet, and it's just a nice straight line.
All right.
Okay.
So then you have your little cup formed.
I do, my little bezel here. And so now we're going to fire things up, Katie.
All right.
So before we do that, I'm going to hand you some safety glasses.
Yes.
I'm going to hand me some safety glasses because we always want to have safety first on this. Now, to prepare this bezel for soldering, since we're using wire solder, I need to go ahead first and use a little bit of flux, and I paint that flux right on the interior of my bezel, and that's going to allow the wire solder to flow. So once I've done that, and I already have some on there, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use the hard solder. And this is the wire solder here, and this is a nifty little trick. I have my little
You're very organized.
Yeah, my little container here. So I've marked that with an H, so I know that that's where my hard solder lives.
Okay.
Now, for the wire solder, this is a special plier that I'm using to cut. And I just come in, get my wire solder, get it in that little hole, and I just cut some little pieces
So
of
then
the
it's
solder.
perfectly measured for what you need.
Exactly.
Handy.
So it's really simple. Now, we're getting close. We're getting close to the soldering. I go ahead and I dip my solder pick into a little bit of water and dip it into the flux, and that allows me to really be able to pick up these little pieces of hard solder here. So it allows me to control it a little bit better. And I would just drop this little piece of solder right on the inside of the bezel, right at the seam. And I've already placed one right in there, so it is time.
It's ready to go.
Yeah. And I'm using that red pick because I'm using the hard solder. So I'm using the red hot pick, and I use a different pick for each of my solders.
Okay.
Now this is a butane torch, and it's butane microtorch, very easy to use, very safe. We want to make sure that we're using this in a well-ventilated area, and you always want to have a fire extinguisher nearby. But other than that, it's perfect for home use.
And you're working on a kiln brick.
Exactly. The kiln brick is my solder surface of choice.
Okay.
All right, so let's fire this up. Now this bezel is going to go pretty quickly. So I'm just going to slowly introduce the flame of the torch into the bezel. And you can see the flux might be bubbling a little bit. And see how that already went? It just, before we could even see it, that little piece of solder has melted, and the solder follows the heat of the flame. So that solder is just going to go right along. And so we've soldered that little end, that little join closed. Now I very carefully, since this kiln brick surface is hot, pick this up with my tweezers and I quench it. So.
Okay.
So that's ready to go. So once we have cleaned that bezel, and you can pickle it.
Use some pickle or something similar.
Something similar. I go ahead and I have painted some flux onto the tag,
surface there.
yeah, the surface. I've placed my bezel where I want it to go, and then I've added 2 pieces of medium solder, and I'll just solder it the same way since I'm using medium solder, since this is our second step.
Okay.
And I just solder it the same way with the torch as I did that bezel.
Okay, so
Okay.
that will look just the same.
Exactly.
Do you want to go ahead and show us?
Sure,
All
I'd
right.
love to.
I'll put my glasses on.
All right, yeah, safety, safety first, as always. So I'm just going to make sure that my little solder is placed perfectly, and I'm going to go ahead and
And this will actually be attaching the bezel to the tag.
it is attaching the bezel to the tag. So what we want to do is, again, come in slowly when you start to heat a piece of metal with the solder on it. If you come in too quickly, the solder is just going to bounce and move around. That's not the end of the world. You could always nudge it back into place with your pick, but we want to avoid trying to do that. And see, as the solder turns glassy, see how it's kind of now glossy and gleaming? See that? My solder, it's kind of hard to see because it goes so quickly, but I'm moving my flame right around the bezel, and can you see how it looks like
Oh,
it's
yeah,
a
we
little
see it.
wet? Yeah.
Oh,
Doesn't it
definitely.
look great? And that is it. It is soldered.
There you go.
Yeah, we're working on such a small little piece of jewelry that, boom,
goes
it's done.
fast.
It does go fast. So now I'm going to pick this up and quench.
Quick.
All right. Now for our last trick. I'm
I'll
going
take
to
this
trade
one,
with
sure.
you here. We're going to put a little bail on the top of this tag. And I've cut this bail out of bead wire. And for ease of use, I'm actually using easy paste solder. And the paste solder already has flux in it, so I don't need to
So
worry
you
about
don't use
fluxing.
any flux there.
Yeah. And I
So
have
3 different types of solder all in this one project.
Exactly, because we're
Great.
using those different steps.
Yeah.
And with that easy paste solder, I've just used my cool blue pick to apply it. And you can see it's almost about the size of a size 11 seed bead. That's about the size of the solder that I've put in.
Yeah, okay, so how are you going to fit the stone in here?
Well, with the stone, what I'll do is I'll solder this on, and I'll go ahead and solder a little jump ring
So
on
that you have a hanger.
So we're ready. Then the trick with setting the stone is I use a little piece of dental floss, and I lay it
Clever.
across. And so I don't have to commit quite yet. I can just check and see if the stone fits in, and the dental floss prevents the stone from being permanently attached. But when I'm ready to permanently attach it, I'm just going to remove my dental floss, and either with your fingers or a little pair of pliers, I'm just going to add the stone right into the bezel, burnish the bezel right around so it cups that stone in, and if I want to antique it or polish it or whatever I want to do, but that's all she wrote.
Okay.
It's that easy.
And for burnishing, you just use your little burnishing
Yeah,
tool.
just a little burnishing tool. It can just be a nice fine little tool, and that'll help you set it in.
Okay, let's take a quick look at the finished one. This is
Okay.
a beautiful project
Thank
and
you.
so wearable
Thank
too.
you.
Thank
Yes,
you, Kate.
my pleasure.
So do you already feel like a designer? Next week we feature bold central elements as we continue to think like a designer on beads, baubles, and jewels.